On July of 1576, Ana of Dietrichstein, a lady-in-waiting in the Spanish court, wrote to her mother, Margarita de Cardona, saying, quote, I think your excellency will be astonished that this letter comes down with so many differences in handwriting. It has been because I was interrupted many times by the infantas. I serve as a secretary to the Infanta Catalina, so when she writes to her grandmother, they ask me to write first so that Her Highness can copy. The Infanta Isabel does not need this sort of thing because she already writes very well. So before we start, who was Ana of Dietrichstein and who was her mother, Margarita de Cardona? The life of these women has been studied recently by the Spanish historian Vanessa de Cruz Medina, especially through their correspondence. Throughout their lives, they exchanged quite a large number of letters, and fortunately, a substantial amount of those letters survived, and they are a treasure trove of information. So Margarita de Cardona was a noble woman. She was an aristocrat. She came from the Cardona family, which is a very ancient, very powerful family from the Kingdom of Aragon. For instance, her father was the Vice King of Sardinia, and her maternal grandmother was the very famous Isabel de Requesens, who was the Vice Queen of Naples, and she was known for being a great beauty of her time, and she was even immortalized by Raphael, the artist, in this painting that nowadays hangs in the Louvre. When in 1548, the future Maximilian II, the future Holy Roman Emperor, married his cousin, Maria of Spain, the eldest daughter of Charles V and his wife, the Empress Isabel of Portugal, Margarita, alongside other members of her family, became members of the household of Maria. And when the imperial couple moved to Vienna, Margarita followed her mistress. Because at this point Margarita was a damsel, which means that she was a young unmarried woman, her marriage was arranged, and she was married to a man called Adam of Dietrichstein. And he was a noble, an Austrian noble. He was a very powerful, very influential figure in the imperial court. Many years later, three of their daughters became ladies-in-waiting in the Spanish court. The eldest one was Maria, and she was a lady-in-waiting to Anna of Austria, the fourth wife of Philip II. The second one was Anna, the author of our letter, and she started as a menina to Joanna of Austria, who was the sister of Philip II. When Joanna died, she became a lady-in-waiting to Queen Anna of Austria, and she also served the daughters of the king, Isabel, Clara, Eugenia, and Catalina, Micaela. The third daughter was called Hippolyta, and she served as a lady-in-waiting to the infantas. So what was Anna talking about in her letter? So she starts the letter by saying that the letter is going to go with very different handwritings. It's the same person writing it. It's just that she's complaining. In a way, she's complaining to her mother, saying that I was trying to write the letter, but I kept being interrupted. So I couldn't write it in just one shot. I had to write and then stop and then continue to write. That's why the calligraphy is probably going to look a little bit strange. And then she continues by saying what were her obligations. So she tells us that she's a secretary to the Infanta Catalina, who was the youngest daughter of the king. And she even gives us more details. She's saying that every time that the Infanta is writing her letter to her grandmother, and by this time the only grandmother that Catalina had alive was Catherine of Medici, who was the Queen of France. So she said that every time she writes to her grandmother, Anna first writes the letter and then the Infanta copies it. You might think, well, the Infanta is getting the laurels and Anna is doing the work. But that's not really what's going on here. This was a way for the Infanta to learn how to write a letter, because she had to follow specific formulas for writing a letter, because she had to know who she was addressing. In this case, she's not just writing a letter to her grandmother, she's writing a letter to the Queen of France. So the letter had to come down in a specific way. So the way for the Infanta to learn how to write this was by copying. So Anna wrote the draft and then she copied it. And by doing that, she would not only learn how to address someone based on their social ranking, but also she would learn how to draw properly the letters. And then Ana finishes by saying that the Infanta Isabel, who is the eldest one, she doesn't need this sort of thing anymore because she already writes by herself. Why did I start the video with this letter? Well, it's because this letter is a very rare open window into a very elusive world, which is the world of the women that served in the royal palace. We tend to have not a lot of information about it. And normally when we say the word ladies in waiting or the expression ladies in waiting, we tend to be very influenced by what we see in entertainment, in films, in series, in literature. And normally the way that these women were portrayed in those mediums has been distorted. They are usually represented as ladies of leisure who don't have much to do except for scheming and flirting. Well, that obviously also took place, but there was a whole different dimension and a whole different meaning in the lives of these women. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the ladies in waiting, in this case of the Spanish court, and we're going to focus on the reign of Philip II. So more or less the second half of the 16th century. So a word, an expression that I used before, and then I'm going to keep using quite a lot during the video, is the household of the queen. So I think it's better to explain what that is in a very simplified way. So the household of the queen is, we can call it almost an institution, that it's both human and financial. The financial side is everything that the queen owned, from the land that she owned to the taxes that she collected from that land to the objects that she had, like her clothing, her jewelry, her tapestries, everything she owned. The human side is the people that served in the household of the queen, and this encompassed both men and women. According to the historian Margarita García Barranco, the household of the queen framed all the offices and services related to the queen's private, public, and religious life. So why would any woman would want to be a lady-in-waiting to the queen? What were the benefits? So according to Vanessa de Cruz Medina, being a lady-in-waiting was practically the only paying job that a noblewoman could perform. They would earn a salary, they were fed and they were housed in the royal palace, and they would have access to royal favors and gifts like dresses, jewelry, precious objects, tapestries. I can give you two examples of this sort of gifts. So, for instance, when Joanna of Austria, the sister of Philip II, became a widow, she decided to go into full, very strict mourning. For many years, she would dress in head to toe black, and she would always have her head and her face covered by a very thick black veil. She would only lift the veil when it was necessary to identify herself as the princess, and then immediately she would put it down and she would conduct her business without anyone seeing her face, at least in public. So this means that she stopped wearing the clothes that she wore before, which were probably not appropriate for a widow. So part of these clothes, she donated them to monasteries, because these clothes had a lot of fabric, and fabric is always something very precious, and they could be turned into religious implements like altar cloths and such. And the other part of her clothes were given to the ladies in waiting, to her mother-in-law, the Queen of Portugal, Catherine of Austria. So not only these ladies gain beautiful, probably very expensive, very valuable clothing, but the clothing that they were given also had the aura of the princess, because people knew that they once belonged to the princess. So this contributed to the prestige of these women. Another example is, many years later, Catherine of Austria died, and in the Spanish court, mourning was decreed. So the household of the queen commissioned and paid for 30 black sayas. The saya is that very formal dress that was worn in the Spanish court for the ladies to wear. Another important reason for a woman to want to become a lady-in-waiting in the household of the queen is because by doing that, they would increase their chances of having a good marriage arranged. And not just that, the king would also pay for a substantial amount of the dowry that was required. The dowry, in a very simple way, is a monetary quantity that the family of the bride gave to the groom. So if the king helped pay for that, they would have a higher dowry, and if they had a higher dowry, their prospects of having a good marriage would increase. This dowry could be used for marriage or also to enter a convent. An example of a wedding arrangement like this is Madalena de Giron. She was the daughter of the camarera mor of the Queen of Spain, Elizabeth of Valois, and I will explain in a minute what a camarera mor is. She was a lady-in-waiting to the Queen as well, and she got her marriage arranged to the Duke of Aveiro, who was a very powerful, wealthy Portuguese duke. So she got an extraordinary wedding. In return, these ladies contributed to the prestige, but also to the authority of the queen, and not just of the queen, but also of the monarchy itself. So how does one become a lady-in-waiting? Well, there are more or less three ways that a woman could become a lady-in-waiting. The first one was through royal decree. So, for instance, the ambassadors, the Spanish ambassadors who were placed in foreign courts, normally they had to travel there, they had to leave Spain, and normally they traveled with their wives. Their daughters that could remain in Spain, they would be admitted in the household of the queen, where they would receive an education and where they would be looked after. Another way was through the clientele network. So the most important families of the kingdom would have their women and girls scouted to serve in the household of the queen. Another way, which is a little bit more rare, was through the talent of these women. So I can give you a very good example of this. The most famous lady in waiting of the Spanish court during the time that we are talking about was Sofonisba Anguissiola. So Sofonisba came from an aristocratic family from the low nobility. She was from Cremona. She was Italian. Cremona is a city that it's near Milan. It's in the north of Italy. And she was famous because she was a painter. Actually, Sofonisba is one of the greatest female painters of the Renaissance. When in 1560, Philip II of Spain married his third wife, Elizabeth of France. She was 14 around this time. And the Spanish court was informed that the princess liked to draw. She liked to paint. So they decided that it was interesting for the young princess to develop her skills. So she would need a teacher, someone that could help her develop the skills that she already possessed. This teacher couldn't be, for instance, Alonso Sanchez Coelho, who was the portrait painter of the king, because he was a man. This teacher had to be a woman. So the Duke of Alba, who for a brief amount of time was the vice king of Milan, knew of this young woman from Cremona who was very talented at painting. So Sofonisba received an invitation to become a lady-in-waiting to the Queen of Spain, and one of her duties was to become her painting, her drawing teacher. And obviously Sofonisba accepted because this was a wonderful opportunity. How were they organized? Were they all equals inside of the household of the queen? No, absolutely not. Society had a very strict hierarchy, and that hierarchy was mirrored inside the household of the queen. Their salary reflected their position, and their position was measured through their social ranking, who were they the daughters of, and also their social status, if they were a damsel, if they were married, or if they were a widow. At the top of this pyramid of women inside the household of the queen was the all-powerful camarera mayor. She was the mistress of the household. She was the chief lady-in-waiting. She was the woman that had the highest authority. She oversaw the entire female staff, not only their daily activities, but also their behavior. This was a very important aspect of her job, and she served the queen directly. Because of this, she also earned the highest salary. Every night, she would sleep in the bedroom of the queen. Obviously, she wouldn't sleep in the same bed as the queen. There was a second bed placed there for her. And during the nights where the king would come and sleep with the queen, because the queen's task was to produce heirs, the camarera mayor would sleep on the adjacent room. So in case that during the night the queen would need something, she was always there, always ready to serve the queen. She was also the one that held the train of the dress of the queen. She would keep her gloves. She would handle the queen her prayer book when the queen was at prayer or when she was at mass, for instance. The camarera mayor was always a woman of very high status, and she was normally married or she was a widow. Why was it important that she was someone that normally was a more mature woman? Because she needed to have experience. She needed to know how the court worked and also how the etiquette was organized. Because we cannot forget that all of these queens, they were foreigners. So they would need someone to guide them in this new life, in this new land. They came from a foreign country. They needed someone that would help them. And this guide would be the camarera mayor. She was there to help them become Spanish. She was there to help in their Hispanization. So the historian Maria Cush gives us a very interesting example of this. In 1560, when Elizabeth of Valois arrived in Spain to marry Philip II, she was wearing French-style clothing. Actually, for her wedding, she did change for Spanish fashion, but after that, she kept wearing her French clothing. And this was a decision made by her camarera mayor, who was the Countess of Ureña. The Countess of Ureña probably thought, well, Elizabeth is 14. She's probably going to grow a little bit more. So while she can fit in her French-style dresses, she can keep wearing them. And when she outgrows them, we're going to dress her in Spanish clothing. So here in this portrait, we can see this portrait was made in the Spanish court a little bit after the arrival of Elizabeth. It was made by Alonso Sanchez Coelho. And we can see here that she, although she's in Spain, she's wearing French clothes. A few years later, we have this portrait, which was painted by Sofonisba, and we can see now she is completely Spanish. She's wearing Spanish fashion, and now she's a Spanish queen, no longer a French princess. So by changing her dresses, the Countess of Ureña was contributing to the Hispanization of Elizabeth. This portrait also gives us another piece of information about how the good services of a camarera mayor could be rewarded. So, for instance, after the death of Elizabeth, we can see here in this painting that she's wearing these sort of pearl clasps, closing her black dress. And when she died, these were given to her camarera mayor, who at that time was no longer the Countess of Ureña because she had died, who at that point, her camarera mayor was the Duchess of Alba. So because of her good services, she got to keep the jewelry of her mistress. Right below the camarera mayor, we have the doñas de honor and the guardas mayores y menores. Normally, these were older, more mature women. Usually, they were married or they were widows, and their main task was to keep an eye on the behavior of the younger girls. After them came the ayas. They were also normally mature, married, or widows, and they were responsible for the royal children. Underneath them, we have the damas, the damsels, which were the young unmarried women who lived and served in the household of the queen. And we also have the meninas, which are the children, the little girls that came in the household of the queen to be educated. All these groups that I talked about were privileged groups. They came from an aristocratic background. Right below them, we have people like the laundresses, the seamstresses, the nannies, the dwarves, and also at the bottom of the pyramid, the enslaved women. If these women had to serve the queen, where did they live? Unlike the male members of the household of the queen and also the household of the king, the women who served the queen, they had to live in the palace. In 1561, Philip II decided to move the court from Toledo to Madrid, and in Madrid, the main royal residence was the Alcázar. They also had other residences around the city of Madrid, like Aranjuez or the Escorial, but in the city, this was the most important royal house. The historian Vanessa de Cruz Medina has a really interesting article about the housing of these ladies. I'm going to leave the link in the description, and at the end of the video, I have a list of all the sources that I use for this video, so don't forget to check them. So here we have an image that depicts the royal palace of Madrid, the Alcázar, during the 1560s. The royal palace was divided not only vertically but also horizontally. So we can see here better in this floor plan, which is from the mid 16th century. In the center of the palace, we have the royal chapel, and right behind it, we have the great staircase of the palace. On the right side, we have a large courtyard. That courtyard was called the courtyard of the queen, and around it, we have the rooms that belong to the queen. On the left side, we have the courtyard of the king, and surrounding it, we have the male wing of the palace where the king lived. So on the ground floor, we have the space where all the commoners live and work. The ones that I talked about, the seamstresses, the nannies, the cooks, they all work and live on the ground floor. On the upper floor, the noble floor, that's where the royal family lives. That's where the queen and the infantas and the princesses had their rooms. Above them, on the second floor, that's where the ladies lived, right above the chambers of the queen. So it's interesting to note that the palace is not only divided through social class, but it's also divided by gender. There was a staircase that connected all the floors, and on the bottom of that staircase was the Porteria de las Damas, which was the gateway of the ladies. And there was always a guard there to keep an eye on who was coming out and who was going in. This was because to go inside the rooms of the ladies, you had to have permission. They could not receive visitors without having the permission of either the queen or the king or the camarera mayor, and the same thing was applied to them leaving the palace. They had to ask for permission, unlike the men who could go in and out of the palace without asking for it. The number of rooms that each lady was given depended on their age, their social status, but also their proximity to the queen. So, for instance, the damas, the damsels, and the meninas, normally they had to share a room. They only had one room and they had to share it with someone else. Normally they were grouped according to their family relations. So, for instance, you could have cousins together, sisters together, an aunt and a niece. They could also be put together according to their friendship. Sophonisba, who was a damsel, she was a dama, she actually had the right to have two rooms. This was because when Sophonisba became a lady-in-waiting, she wasn't exactly young for the 16th century. She was 25. An unmarried woman at 25 was not considered young. But she had the right to have these two rooms because most likely this second room that she had, she used it as her painting atelier. The older ladies and also ladies of higher status, they would normally have more than one room. And in the second room, they could have an oratory, they could use it for storage, or they could also use it to house their servants and slaves, because these women also have slaves and servants of their own. These rooms, they were flexible and adaptable. They were divided with wooden panels, and those panels were covered with guedemsige, which are decorated panels of leather. So they could be made bigger or smaller. One room could be divided into two or three or more. There was generally always complaints about the lack of space, especially from the younger ones, because everybody wanted more space and everybody wanted more rooms. So now that we know how these rooms were organized, let's try to understand what did they had inside. We actually have a really interesting source of information to know what these ladies had inside. It's a very rare example. It's an inventory that was made after the death of one of these ladies in waiting. So Maria de Cordova y Aragon, she was a lady in waiting to the queen, to Anna of Austria, and in 1580 she died of plague in the Alcázar of Madrid. So an inventory was made with all the possessions that she has. The historian Elisa García Prieto has a very interesting article about it. I'm going to leave the link in the description. So let's see what she had inside her room. So she had her bed, and her bed had a canopy, the drapings on top, and we know that they were in velvet and they were yellow and blue. She also had a box that the bed would be stored and would be used to travel around, because normally these ladies, if the queen went to Aranjuez or if she went to the Escorial, they could accompany her and they would bring their furniture with them. So there was this box that was ready to transport her bed. She also had several writing desks like this one. They have two parts. One is the lower part where you could actually write, and then he has an upper panel with little drawers. And these little drawers were used to organize her smaller possessions, like her jewelry, her sewing kit. For instance, we know that she had a silver thimble for sewing. She had several boxes and trunks that were used for storage, like, for instance, her silverware that she could use. Some of the silverware was used for her for eating, for her meals, and others were used for her hygiene. She had 5 panels of tapestry, which would keep her room warm in the winter. They would bring light and color and decoration and comfort to the space. She also had her clothing. She had several linen shirts, which was the basic underwear for everybody during the time period. She had a farthingale, which is that skirt that has hoops that creates the conical shape, very characteristical of 16th century Spanish fashion. She had 4 sayas, which are that very formal dresses used for court ceremonies. It's very interesting because most likely one of them that is described as a black saya is one of those 30 black sayas that were commissioned that I talked about before when the Queen of Portugal died. So one of them belonged to Maria de Cordova y Aragon. She also has 10 vesquinhas, which are petticoats, and she also has 10 jubones, which are doublets, and several ropas. The ropa was a loose fit gown, and she had one that was made out of silk, and it was of crimson silk, and it's described as the one that she used when she woke up. And she also had her accessories, she had her gloves, she had her hats, and of course the chapines, the very thick-soled shoes that were very characteristical of the Iberian Peninsula, although they were also used in places like Italy, and they looked like this ones, which is a Spanish pair from the mid-16th century, which is now housed in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. Alongside her clothing, she would also have her jewelry. She also had books of different themes. She had 2 musical instruments. She had a guitar and she had an harp, and she also had religious objects like rosaries, crosses, and even relics. In the quarters of the ladies, there were 2 common rooms. This makes me think almost that it looked like a boarding school. One of them was the Estrado de las Damas, the dais of the ladies, and the other one was the gallery of the ladies. The dais of the ladies was a space where they could receive visitors, always with chaperones, obviously, where they could chat, they could play musical instruments, they could dance, they could sew, they could embroider, they could spend leisure time, and it was also the space where they would eat together. The other space was the gallery of the ladies, and it was probably located on top of the gallery of the queen. And this space was used for them to walk around, for chatting, and it was also used for them to display their collection of objects, of interesting artistic objects. Some of them were probably exotic objects. This room, the gallery of the ladies, sometimes could also be divided with panels to create more rooms. This was something that the ladies absolutely hated because they would lose that space that could be used for them to walk around. And this was very important because a lot of the times they couldn't leave the palace, not even to the exterior. So they needed to have a place where they could move, they could talk. And if the room was divided into other spaces, they would lose that space. So now that we know that how these ladies were organized and where they live, let's talk about what they did. So the first thing they did every morning was helping the queen getting ready to dress up and to wash herself. Before that, they had to do that themselves. They had to wake up, they had to dress, they had to wash, and then they had to come down and help the queen do it. The queen would wear the clothes that were previously chosen by the Camarera Mayor, and she was also the one responsible for handling the towel and the water that she would use for cleaning herself. After that, the ladies would accompany the queen to mass. That could be in the chapel of the royal palace or in the oratory of the queen, or in any of the churches and monasteries in the city of Madrid. So sometimes they could actually go outside and accompany the queen. They could also spend their time receiving visitors in the palace. They could walk, they could dance, they could listen to music. They could also participate in theater plays. A lot of the times they wrote the plays themselves. They would also play cards, and we know that they played cards for money. They gambled quite a lot. Or like Sofonishba, they could paint or draw. We know that some of these ladies were able to do so. These ladies would also participate in the public meals of the queen, where they would serve her, and they were organized according to shifts, so every week a different one would serve the queen. They also had other chores and activities, but probably one of the most important is their education. They learned to read and write in the palace, probably from a priest that was related to the royal chapel, or it could be even the older women teaching the younger ones. So there was this idea of an exchange of knowledge and practices between the older and the younger generation. Not only would they learn to read and write, but they would also have to study mathematics. They had to be able to manage their expenses, and they had to send reports of the money that they spent to their families. And this was important not only because of that, but because these girls, they were being prepared for marriage, and in the future they had to manage the household of their husband. So it was important for them to have these skills. They also spend time reading, and some of them even have a small library. Remember María de Córdoba y Aragón? She had a small library in her chambers, and sometimes they would even read out loud to entertain their mistresses. Not only that, but for instance, they also played with the infantas, the daughters of the king. This might sound like it's almost something frivolous, but let's not forget they were all of them, they were competing to be the favorite of the queen and the favorite of the princesses. So they were always trying to find ways to please them. They would also learn what we can call social skills, things like knowing how to dress properly, knowing how to walk, how to behave, how to dance. These were all very important skills for someone who lived at a court in the 16th century. For instance, there is this very interesting example. So the moment that they stopped being meninas, which is the children, and became damsels, which means women, young women that are ready for marriage, was when they started wearing the chapines, the very thick soled shoes. This was a sort of a rite of passage, and they had to practice with a dancing instructor, and when the queen gave them permission, they could start using them, and they would sort of graduate as a young woman who was ready for marriage or for the convent. Overall, they had a very privileged access to a very good education, because a lot of the times they would share the same teachers as the princesses. When the time came, these young damsels would marry or go into a monastery. When that happened, normally they left the court, but some of them stayed, because if they married, for instance, a man that served in the household of the king or the queen, they would continue to be ladies in waiting. But a lot of them did end up leaving the court, leaving the palace, and moving to their husbands' estates or to the monastery. And although they stopped serving in the household of the queen, the fact that they once were ladies in waiting to the queen gave them a huge prestige, and that prestige would follow them throughout their lives. So now let's see what happened to Margarita de Cardona and to her daughters. So Maria, Ana, and Hippolyta, they served as ladies in waiting, and they are the typical case of ladies that got married and left the palace. They left the service. In the case of Margarita, after she became a widow, she returned to Spain, and her former mistress, the Empress Maria, which was now also a widow, was living in Madrid as well, and she asked for permission to once again serve her. So once again, Margarita packed her bags and she moved to Spain, and she served her mistress until the end of her days. So this is everything for today's video. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you on the next one.